Let's bring in our panel now. We're joined by Taig Hickey, a comedian, political activist from Ireland, Dorian Lynskey, a journalist, author and host of the Origin Story podcast. And rounding out our panel, Adela Cojab, an activist, legal advocate and author. Welcome to all of you here on Counterpoints. Words matter. There's no doubt about that. But do they matter more than actions? Is it just easier to be outraged at the words of three young rappers like Kneecap rather than exploring the actions of governments or organisations, including Israel, Hamas or Hezbollah? There's no doubt Kneecap has touched on a really sensitive topic, a host of sensitive topics. So I want to begin by asking whether you think this level of outrage is justified. Taig, let's start with you.
Well, I think what's very clear about the level of outrage, even in my own country in Ireland, we have had wall-to-wall coverage of Kneecap's words. The geopolitical thoughts of a hip-hop trio has dominated the news cycle in Ireland and in Britain, from what I can gather, and obviously in the States. And this has happened over a 2-week period where there have been massacres every day in Gaza, where we aren't talking about not just the Israeli war crimes, but we're also not talking about the UK and the US, and indeed Ireland to a lesser extent, our complicity in these war crimes, which human rights bodies across the board are describing as war crimes. So I think it's a convenient method of obfuscation. It's a convenient distraction ploy so that people look over here and then the scale of the war crimes goes up in Gaza. I think it's a job well done for our media. I think our media really need to be held to account because at the end of the day, they set the agenda, and they have certainly set the agenda over the last 2 weeks that it's more important for us to police the thoughts and the words of a hip hop trio than it is the actions of our government. It's particularly kind of mind-blowing from an Irish perspective when the British government particularly is trying to police the thinking and the words of an Irish Republican hip-hop group when they have had no ability or desire over the years to actually look at their own deeds, their own war crimes, their own obfuscation of justice for people in the north of Ireland. So I think in Ireland we see through it very quickly, and I think the attention, as always, in these issues is in the wrong direction.
Adela, let me ask you then, what do you make of this level of outrage? Do you think it's justified?
I think the level of outrage is absolutely justified. And I do find it interesting how we're talking about how the media focusing on this is a ploy to get attention away from what's happening in Gaza when it was itself a media stunt. The goal was publicity. If you ask why did he go on stage at Coachella in front of an audience of hundreds of thousands, not only in person, but we're talking about social media, we're talking about the mainstream media, and display those messages, it is because you're looking for publicity. So that was the goal. So we can't be upset with the media for doing exactly what the band intended to do with their messaging, which is blow it up as far as we can. In terms of policing, I think that something that's important of looking at here, it's not just that they were displaying messages against Israel. The messages said up Hamas and up Hezbollah. And those are two very different things than just saying, down with the specific government. If you're saying up Hamas, up Hezbollah, recognize terrorist organizations, and not only terrorist when it comes to the Israeli context. If you ask any citizen of Lebanon whether or not Hezbollah is a terrorist organization, you'll find that the overwhelming majority would agree. So when you're glorifying terror acts, and then you're upset that people are looking at you for glorifying terror acts in a media optic, then yes, of course, the outrage is justified. It was meant to provoke a response from the media, and the overwhelming majority of people don't support terrorism. So if they're getting backlash, it's for their own actions.
I mean, Kneecap have been supporting the Palestinian cause when they were playing to just hundreds of people without any TV cameras, let alone Coachella. So it's not as if they say this is a new cause for them. But Dorian, let me ask you, you wrote an incredibly interesting piece for The Guardian newspaper talking about what you called hypocrisy on both sides. Do you think that this level of outrage is justified?
I mean, I don't think this level of outrage is ever justified with a pop group, essentially. I think it always seems like an easy target it always strikes me as sort of absurd. That's separate to the issue of individual statements they've made and whether those are open to criticism, for sure. And I would like to point out that actually the references to Hamas and Hezbollah were from gigs in London, I believe, in late 2023, which is quite different from the statements they made at Coachella, which I think are more easily defensible. So those are two quite sort of different controversies. The controversy just sort of rolled on, and then these old clips were dug out. And of course it's exaggerated. Of course, it just seems like, are we really devoting all this energy to whether or not this band should play Glastonbury or any number of festivals compared to the issues that they're talking about? That doesn't mean, of course, that you cannot criticize some of the things that they've said. So when I was referring to hypocrisy on both sides, you know, traditionally, particularly in recent years, the right has really flown the flag of free speech and has protested about cancel culture and people's careers being, you know, hurt or destroyed over saying this or that. They're obviously trying to do like exactly that. And of course, they go, well, of course, well, if you say this, then you deserve to have your career destroyed. And then I think on the left and in the artistic community, there's a kind of, it's quite unclear that a lot of people are not defending what was actually said, they're defending the right to say it. And then that leads you into a position where you become more free speech absolutist, when that has not generally been the position over the last few years. So it is a tricky one. I think it does put a lot of their kind of allies and people who also sympathize with the Palestinian cause in a tricky situation over the things that were said back in late 2023. That's why I find it complicated, although in no sense justifying the kind of coverage that it's been getting over the last 2 weeks.
Let me ask you, if we set aside the Free Palestine comments and stage signage at Coachella, if we look at those comments from the London gig, I think November 2023, the Up Hamas, Up Hezbollah comments, is that, though, inciting hatred? Is that supporting a terrorist group that is a proscribed outlaw organisation in the country where they did that concert? Is that free speech or is that a violation of the law?
Well, I mean, an awful lot of grace would be given to, say, comedians, for instance. Comedians, I mean, I'm a comedian. I don't expect to be policed on what I say in comedy gigs. Like, this is an act that are quite ironic in the stuff that they're delivering. Even their title, they're not, you know, supporting the idea of kneecapping. They're irreverently talking about the culture that they came out of. Like, to scrutinize what they're saying at gigs and to be policing them, in my opinion, and I also agree with the idea that I'm not a free speech absolutist, but I also believe that there are things that you shouldn't say all out calling for specific acts of violence against particular people. Let's go to their houses and let's kill them right now. I'm not for that. But if we look at the big picture, this is art. Like, they're artists and they say stuff in context when they're performing their art, which is often ironical. I mean, I'll be consistent. I feel like attempts to censor Zionist acts in the arts world are also completely reductive and pointless. I wouldn't have supported the idea of cancelling Johnny Greenwood recently whatsoever, because I'm a proponent of, if both sides were allowed to express themselves artistically, then so many more people would support the Palestinian cause. That's why TikTok was banned, because people are naturally drawn to the Palestinian cause because, in my opinion, it's so obviously righteous and just.
Would you say it, though? You were saying you're a comedian and you don't expect to be policed. Would you have said, Up Hamas, Up Hezbollah at a gig?
I don't know. It's not something that I would have thought about. If you're suggesting to me, would I go and do it tonight? Well, Hamas, as far as I know, are not a proscribed group in Ireland. I think this whole period is, I hope, going to bring about a really honest and not hysterical conversation about resistance. For me to say that I'm against resistance movements would be ludicrous because I'm Irish. If it wasn't for resistance movements, I wouldn't live in a free, independent, albeit partly free and independent country. We need to have a serious, non-hysterical conversation about resistance in the same way that we have to have a serious, non-hysterical conversation about cancelling people for their thoughts and words, as opposed to looking at governments for the ridiculous deeds. Even the fact that we're talking about this right now, in a way, also kind of gets in the way of the real conversations that we should be having, maybe not us specifically, but that the world should be having, which is the fact that the West is aiding and abetting an ongoing genocide and mass starvation engineered by a rogue state is going on, and we're all sitting around chatting and hoping our governments will suddenly see the light and do the right thing.
Adela, let me ask you then. We just heard Tig there mention Johnny Greenwood, the guitarist from Radiohead, who had been touring with an Israeli artist. Some of their gigs have been cancelled as well, and they've been criticised, Johnny Greenwood particularly, accused of artistic greenwashing. If you think that Kneecaps shouldn't have been able to say that and they should be cancelled, do you think that Johnny Greenwood should be cancelled too? Because surely it should be fair on both sides.
It shouldn't be fair on both sides, but I think that the important thing here when we talk about cancel culture is why cancel culture is happening and what actually makes it cancel culture. The right is upset about cancel culture when you're canceled by virtue of your identity. For example, I'm canceling this gig because you're Israeli or because you are Palestinian. Very different when you use that specific gig as a platform for a specific cause. Also very different from, for example, let's say I'm an artist and in my personal Twitter, I'm tweeting about a cause I care about. Very different from coming on stage to a venue where people bought tickets for a show and using that as a venue to advocate. And that's why I think that they're completely different. When the right talks about cancel culture, they're not saying, that you can't go out there, and they talk about it in the terms of me as a person or me because of prior statements is being canceled and now it's affecting my career. Very different from someone who uses that as their platform. But when we're talking about resistance culture, right, we're talking about whether or not people have a right to resist. People absolutely have a right to resist. But I do want to, from the get-go, separate Ireland and the case right now in Gaza, because the difference is that the people in Gaza were given autonomy in 2005 and they elected a terror organization that chants from the river to the sea, and their goal is to destroy the state of Israel, right? They say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. We don't want no two states. We want all of it. We don't want no 48. We want all of it. It's not about fighting for autonomy in your land. It's about fighting against an existing entity that currently possesses land. So it is very different. You can't look at them as identical. And also, correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that Ireland was won via war negotiation in 1922. But when it comes to Hamas and Gaza, there were multiple deals for Palestinian statehood. Every single one of them rejected, and it wasn't by the Israeli side. So I support resistance movements when diplomacy fails. And here diplomacy had an avenue not to fail. So I also think it's important to separate the two from the get-go. But yes, had an Israeli artist used their platform in order to advocate for a cause and then been canceled, it would be morally equivalent. But that's not what happened with Johnny Greenwood. With Johnny Greenwood, it wasn't about him using his platform to advocate for a cause. It was by virtue of his identity. That is cancel culture.
Dorian, I'm going to come to you, but Tig, I can see you grinning there a little bit. Is there anything you want to add?
Well, I just wanted to quickly say, aside from the fact that every deal that the Palestinians were offered, I think, has been well documented, were ludicrously one-sided right up until Oslo. And I think that's a well-established historical fact that there was no deal that was in any way approaching reasonable from a Palestinian perspective. I would just like to tell your viewers that there are no political parties in Ireland, like with the exception of one or two who have come about in the last maybe 10 years, all historical parties in Ireland were linked to military groups. So the reason that we have a government, our first government had come directly out of a military group. Our opposition were the first associated political party with the IRA. The whole of Ireland comes from military resistance movements, because that's just what happens when you're an occupied, colonial experienced country and you've come out of colonial oppression, and that's just the way it is.
Dorian, let me ask you, you've written a book about protest music. Is the Kneecap situation an example of selective outrage? Or if you are going to market yourself as a protest act, you kind of are asking for it?
Well, it depends what you say. It depends what you say in your music and what you say on stage and what you say in interviews. I think the problem is that, I mean, the comparison was made there to sort of comedy. It's not quite the same, but there are certain things that are said in music, and you can look at the whole history of hip hop, and they're not exactly ironic or unfelt, but they're not meant to be taken seriously, right? Like there's a long tradition of rappers making claims in their songs, which, if true, then they would be mass murderers. Well, they're not, right? There is an element of performance there. And so sometimes I've come across many artists in the past who have sort of said that so-and-so politician should be shot, right? Which is one of the things that Kneecaps said on stage. Sometimes that's caused controversy. Sometimes it's passed unnoticed. There is a sort of freedom to say provocative things in the world of music and I've seen people say things on stage, which I don't agree with, but it hasn't caused mass outrage in the room. So what has happened here is this sort of escape the confines of the gig and of the musical world. And then you see that in black and white in the press and you think, wow, that's an appalling thing to say, saying go and shoot an MP. That's terrible. I was friends with university with Joe Cox, the British MP who was murdered. Obviously, I'm not going to go out there and defend that statement on its face. And so there is this kind of it's a kind of contextual shift, and that a lot of fairly outrageous things can stand in the world of music as they stand in the world of comedy. So that is different from actually therefore going, and then I think some people would then completely defend actually what Kneecap said on the face of it. That's a whole other debate about what you think of Hamas and Hezbollah. But I'm always just a bit suspicious of the motives of the people that are pursuing this and then calling for bans and this and that. What difference does it make? I mean, these statements, the worst statements, were made in late 2023. Clearly, they've incited nothing, right? There is no, they've not inspired anybody to do anything. Most people at that gig would probably have just sort of let that slide. So that the out of proportion really, really worries me. But I would love it if they could clarify, perhaps, maybe what they did mean. It's like, well, do you think this should happen? Do you support those groups or do you not? But I think people are used to, in music, living in this kind of gray area, which can sometimes seem a little slippery, where it's like you both do and do not mean something.
And that sort of grey area, it takes us to our next segment that I want to discuss, artistic freedom of expression. It's not just a privilege, it's a recognised human right, according to the UN. But in this modern age of collective outrage and cancel culture, is it a luxury our society just is no longer able to afford? Adela, with that in mind, I want to ask you, should there be limits to artistic freedom?
It's a really good question. And I'm coming from the United States, so of course our laws are what they are. And when it comes to artistic freedom, of course we have a broad array of laws. And the first thing is we have to ask, is it protected speech? Is it actually artistic, or is it something else, right? So when you talk about, for example, we were saying before, what did you mean by up Hamas? What did you mean by up Hezbollah? Would we be having the same conversation if in the context of the US they said up ISIS or up the KKK? I think that if an artist in a platform as large as Coachella, or that has been platformed in a place as large as Coachella, came out to have said up the KKK, I think in the United States specifically, we would have the same amount of outrage and you would have the same amount of cancel culture. But again, you have to look at it individually. So speaking from the point of view legally, should there be limits to artistic expression? Absolutely. Absolutely. And we have those limits. Those limits do exist. And one of the main things that we look at is whether it's pure speech or whether that moves into action. So if they're calling for an action, so for example, they say down with the government, and then they say something like take action into your own hands, that's absolutely a limit. And I think that living in a country that does have laws, that's the social contract that you have. And we all understand what the laws are and we all play by those rules. And by the way, that's the same issue if we're talking about, for example, college campus free speech. That's where you saw free speech turn into action. It's no longer speech, and then that becomes actionable. So yes, there should be limits to artistic expression. I think we've seen limits to artistic expression. And actually, today is a really good day to talk about this. I don't know if you saw, but Kanye West just dropped his new song called Heil Hitler. And it starts with the words, my N-words, Heil Hitler. And I don't know about what your feeds are seeing, but my Instagram since the song came out about 2 hours ago has been full of Kanye West and people canceling him for the billionth time. So we're talking about artistic outrage. We're talking about, specific outrage, chosen outrage. We're talking about selective outrage. I don't think it's selective. I think that when you say something truly outrageous, there will be outrage. And in the case of Kanye West and in the case of Kneecap, I've seen both.
Dorian, I see you shaking your head there, but I just want to quickly ask Taig first what you make of that comparison that Adela made between what Kneecaps said and, you know, whether they were, if they were going to say something about the KKK or ISIS. Should there be limits? As a comedian, shouldn't you be able to have artistic freedom of expression like the UN prescribes?
Well, I'd first of all argue that if somebody said up Al Qaeda, for instance, in the US at the moment, it could be taken as a compliment when the West have like totally embraced a former Al Qaeda leader as the current president of Syria. But I think, again, I would agree with the point on the social contract if the social contract still had any meaning. I think most people in the West now are seeing that there actually isn't, and most people in the global South primarily, I suppose, see that there are no rules. There is no international law. There is no social contract. If somebody says something outrageous, they should be cancelled, and they should have, you know, there should have repercussions for that. I agree with that, but at the risk of being tedious, a state backed by the strongest state in the world is carrying out outrageous acts as we speak right now, and there are no repercussions.
But what about what Adela was saying with the Kanye West's new song? Surely there are limits to what we can accept.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, if you're talking about a world that still had rules in it and still had order, yes, I think that's totally unacceptable. I'm absolutely against anti-Semitism. But I would quickly say, as an artist, I'm an artist. I produce satire. I produce satire that is often poking fun at the hypocrisy of the West, is pro-Palestinian. I've been banned from TikTok twice. I get my material taken down from YouTube all the time. I get my stuff taken down from Instagram. So as an artist, either I'm an absolutely outrageous artist, or there's one set of rules for one group and another set of rules for another group. I'd be really interested to hear from Zionist satirists, if they exist. Do their material get taken down randomly? Because all I know in the pro-Palestinian movement in Ireland, whether you're a satirist or whether you're a mother who just cares about children being burned alive in their tents, we're all getting restricted. So again, there is no rules-based order, so it's very hard to be, I suppose, very proactive or about which rule we're to follow and which rule we aren't.
Dorian, I do want to come to you, but Adela, I feel like I should throw it over to you. I know you're not a satirist, but can you respond to what Taig is saying?
Absolutely.
Is there one rule for people who support one side, another rule for others?
So it's a good question. And I wouldn't consider myself an influencer, but I do have a substantial following on Instagram, and I used to have one on TikTok. I've been banned multiple times on Instagram. I couldn't go live for 60 days. I've had my account restricted in every single possible way, especially after October 7th, when I was speaking up against anti-Semitism and speaking up against what we were seeing in the United States, France, the UK, internationally on October 8th. I'm no longer on TikTok, and I'm no longer a user. I have my account there, but it's pretty much entirely restricted because I also was deplatformed on TikTok. So it's a universal experience. And again, it comes back to social contract. So we want to live in a place where there are limits to speech and we all abide by that social contract? Or do you want to live in a place where you can say whatever you want and then we let the free market decide those ideas? And I think that as a society, at least Western countries decided that we wanted to live in a place that has rules, even if it limits some of our actions, knowing that it's also limiting other actions that we might not like. So yes, in terms of the deplatforming, I'm sorry you've been deplatformed. I do want to say that when it comes to, at least legally, comedy has more leeway and satire and parody has much more leeway than, for example, artistic expression in the form of music or in the form of theater or in the form of art. So there is a difference. And I do think that satire and comedy has a purpose and it can serve that purpose better than other forms of artistic expression. But yes, when it comes to pro-Israel voices, we have all.
Do you feel like we both deserved to be banned then? Do you feel that we're two extremists, just as a matter of interest?
I don't, but I also know that people who use social media who have been bombarded with both your content and mine might be grateful for these laws. And again, it's a social contract. All of these are private platforms that are now become the public square. So it runs into this weird legal area where you say, what is the public square and what is considered a private company? When do their bylaws run into the issues with the countries that they're in? If they operate Twitter in the UK, operate Twitter in the US and in Latin America, how are those rules different? So it does come down to a legal distinction, but I think you're right. I don't think I should have been deplatformed. I don't think that I should have been banned from going live or collaborating on posts for 60 days. I was able to fight them internally. Some of them were released, some of them weren't. And funny enough, a lot of the posts that were taken down from me was content of protests where people were doing Nazi salutes. I was raising awareness about the Nazi salutes, and then I was deplatformed for spreading Nazi propaganda. So it's, again, who is in the driver's seat, who gets to decide what's taken down and what isn't, is a good question. But again, it's part of the social contract that we've all subscribed to.
Mm-hmm. All right, Dorian, let me circle back to you, especially when we were talking about Kanye West. When Adela first mentioned it, you were sort of nodding your head. Weigh in. Is there a line? Should there be limits to artistic freedom of expression? Does something like naming your song Heil Hitler go too far?
Well, I just think it's really important to think about what are these limits. You know, the way people talk about cancel culture and bans and what should be allowed and what should be accepted. It's like, well, what do they mean? So we've got the laws of different countries, right? America has the First Amendment. European countries tend to have stricter laws against hate speech. Then you have the decisions made by people who run platforms. You know, since Elon Musk turned Twitter into X, you know, there is just rampant fascism, racism, anti-Semitism, like any prejudice you can ask for, and that's certainly a version of free speech that I've just chosen to withdraw from. Then you're asking, okay, well, what do politicians weigh in? Should politicians be pressuring record labels, be pressuring festivals? You know, there's a famous case in 1992 about Ice-T's rock band Body Count, and they had a song called Cop Killer, and there was enormous pressure from police lobbying bodies and the President George H.W. Bush, on the record label to delete this song, right? So there's all these kinds of things. Do I think that Ye's song Heil Hitler is sort of disgusting? Yes. Does most of the music community? Yes. Like, he's not appearing on bills, he's not working with the people he used to work with. Do I think that it should somehow be like banned, wiped from the internet? You know, probably not. And probably that would be, you know, there's probably no legal mechanism to do that. So I just think having some real clarity about what it means to sort of not accept something, and the difference between, for example, somebody being genuinely, truly outraged by what Kneecaps said and a politician asking a festival to drop them from the bill. Those are two like really different things. And then what if somebody said, well, their album should be withdrawn. They shouldn't be allowed to do this. They shouldn't be allowed to do that. So what you're really asking is, it's a lot of different questions about different mechanisms, everything from social disapproval to the law via boycotts and no platforming and bans and so on. And so I do think that all these arguments have to be quite precise and case by case and sophisticated, because it's never free speech versus no free speech.
You mentioned Cop Killer, which really segues nicely into our final segment, because this kind of public flogging of artists is not necessarily new. Back in 1992, Sinead O'Connor was slammed in the US for ripping up that photo of the Pope in protest against child abuse in the Catholic Church. The Dixie Chicks, now known as the Chicks, they effectively killed their career for years when they criticised President George W. Bush's war in Iraq. And so now we're seeing things like venues being cancelled and sponsors being pulled out. Taig, do you think that we now run the risk that artists and public figures are just too scared to speak out? They're too scared to say anything. They will self-censor for fear of being cancelled?
Absolutely, definitely. I mean, I'm definitely seeing it in the comedy world where, you know, I know a lot of people in Ireland and Britain would be privately very supportive of the Palestinian cause, for instance, but would be afraid to speak out in public because, I suppose they don't want to be, in my view, wrongly accused of being anti-Semitic. And secondly, because I just feel in the West we've become so completely beholden to consumerism and to the capitalist pursuit of you know, the good life, and people have got work opportunities and they don't want to upset their brand deals. I think it's a sad state of affairs in music as well. I mean, the musicians I grew up listening to, the punk artists, the rock artists, that like if there was an injustice going on in the world, they would be making albums about it, and people have just become I don't know, just the consumerism has kind of thwarted freedom of expression. But you will pay a price. Like, I mean, any of the artists I do know, including myself in this part of the world, in Ireland is seen as a relatively pro-Palestine country. I find it extraordinarily hard to get any commercial work because I've spoken up. People can go and look at the historical record. I haven't been shouting about how amazing Hamas are or anything like that. I've just been advocating for people who are going through what I believe and many human rights organizations believe is a genocide. I'm just advocating for them. A lot of them are my friends. I can't get any work in Ireland since October 7th. I used to get a lot of voiceover work. I haven't had any voiceover work in like a year and a half. Perhaps I've just overnight become a really terrible voiceover artist, but it seems a little bit fishy to me. And a lot of people experience the same. So you will pay a price if you speak up. So I understand that's the way neoliberalism has worked, that you toe the line or else you don't get work. And you just have to choose between your authenticity, your humanity, or your pay packet. And I'm very happy with the decision that I've made.
Adela, let me ask you to comment on that. There are claims by some in the field that an Israel lobby is behind this cancelling, this pressure on groups such as Kneecap, perhaps such as Taig. What do you make of those claims?
Well, I can't speak to Israel lobbies because I'm not a part or a member of any of them. But what I can say is that I've actually seen the opposite from my friends that are in the industry. I have friends that are beauty influencers that are in theater that have pretty large followings. And they felt that after October 7th, after the boycott lists went out, if you didn't speak up about Palestine and you didn't post something on your story, you would end up in a circulated boycott list. And some of them lost tens of thousands of followers. So it's interesting that you feel it in the opposite direction, where people have to self-censor out of fear of being canceled. But I've met a lot of people that felt that they were compelled to say things they don't quite believe or they don't quite stand behind in order to continue to work or to continue to keep their followings. So I think that when both sides are feeling pressure in this way, it means that we have to have a conversation instead of having boycotts. And I think you're right. I think a lot of people have been avoiding having the conversation. But when it comes to Israel lobbies, I mean, I'm not aware of any coordinated effort. What I do know is email lists, which is the same thing that you see on either side. When Colombia does something that we don't agree with, or an artist does something that you don't agree with, email campaigns go out. I've seen them on both sides. I'm on both email lists. I don't think that there's any tactic that's new.
Dorian, what about you? You've written widely about protest music. Has cancel culture gone so far that it's sort of the death of protest music now? Are people self-censoring because they're afraid? And what does that mean for protest music?
I don't think so. I wouldn't use the term cancel culture in that context. I think there's a lot of structural reasons why there are fewer protest songs, or certainly why fewer of them are breaking through. There's all kinds of different things. Some of them just simply, like the shift from purchasing to streaming, means that the charts become more static and homogenous, and it's harder for these sort of weird spiky songs to break through. And I think that unfortunately, a product of the social media era is that people are more nervous about what they say and where that can be picked up. There are things that people said in the music press back in the 80s that I'd never heard of. I came across them in my research and I was like, I cannot believe that I've just never heard of this, and they never got into trouble for this. So there was more sort of freedom to speak then, for sure. But that doesn't mean that people are fearing a particular lobby, a particular government. It's somehow like even relatively innocent stuff can get twisted. So I do think that there is a kind of a self-censorship that is not a kind of result of some authoritarian culture, but of across the political spectrum, the way that people behave on social media, the way that people can be ripped apart for the mildest things. And I think that does make people self-censor. Although I would say, for example, on the issue of Gaza, there are many artists in the UK. I know it's hard, I think probably harder in the US, but many artists in the UK and on Ireland who have spoken out in favor of Palestine. So it's not like you can't. It's not like you cannot do that.
Before we wrap up, we're almost out of time, but I just want to get a really short statement from each of you, just as sort of a final thought. Taig, I'm going to start with you. Is our society too sensitive these days to provocative art?
Yes, I think our society needs to look at provocative actions rather than provocative art primarily. And I would just like to finish by saying we've been talking a lot about two sides. I think in this moment in history, it isn't a two sides discussion, really. There are no two sides in a genocide.
Adela, our community, our modern culture, is social media making us too sensitive? Is this idea of collective outrage driving us more so than being stimulated by provocative art?
I think that there's absolutely a culture of collective outrage where if you don't speak up, you're seen as less than. But at the same time, if you look at the way that most Jewish people have reacted to outright anti-Semitism, we offered to take them to Auschwitz so they can understand the Jewish struggle. And that, to me, is the opposite of cancel culture.
Dorian, wrap us up.
Well, unfortunately, social media is designed to do that. That's what the algorithms do. That's how they get the money. It's to wind people up and make them angrier. I think what I find, and I just, that unfortunately, this is what people do. What I find hard to accept is when politicians who have bigger fish to fry target a pop group. And I always find that a little shabby, a little opportunistic. And of course, they are not, whatever Kneecap has said, they are not a national security threat.
A very interesting point to end on. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have here on Counterpoints. But thank you to you, our wonderful panel, for joining us. It's been so interesting. Taig Hickey, comedian and political activist, Dorian Lynskey, journalist and author, and Adela Cojab, activist and legal advocate. Thanks for your time.